Hi, good afternoon. I hope everybody is enjoying the second day of the nation's virtual festival. And I've seen some comments in the chat. I know everybody is excited for this panel. And it's my distinct honor to introduce Secretary Robert Reich. He is the former Secretary of Labor for the Clinton administration and is currently the Chancellor's Professor of Public Policy at the University of California, Berkeley. He has written 17 books, including bestsellers Aftershock, The Work of Nations, Beyond Outrage, The Common Good, and his latest book is The System, Who Rigged It and How to Fix It. He's an award-winning film, Inequality for All, is available on Netflix and other streaming services. And he's also a strong and clear voice for justice with an enormous social media following and continues to have an impact on the issues of our time. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really grateful to have you.
Well, thank you, Erin, and thank you and others at the Nation for putting on this great festival, virtual festival. It's ironic. I mean, it's very hard to interact and to organize and mobilize and get people excited virtually. I mean, this is probably a conservative plot to keep us all separate from each other. But the positive aspect of it is that we can all get together, and it is relatively easy to get together. I want to talk to you today. I'm going to talk about, maybe 15 minutes or so, and then we'll go to your questions, and Erin will intermediate. But here are the major themes. I want to talk about, number one, what to expect from the Biden administration. And what I have to say is based not only on the fact that I know a bunch of people who are kind of around the Biden administration or likely to be in the Biden administration, but also I've been around administrations and in and out of government for more years than I want to even admit. And I have a pretty good idea about what we can expect, given all of the factors that are affecting American politics right now. Secondly, I want to talk about how progressives can both kind of best be influential, be most influential with regard to the Biden administration, and also organizing and mobilizing people at this very difficult is an understatement, point in American history. And if there's time, I want to talk about Trump voters and what's happening right now and what Trump is trying to do with regard to continuing to keep the fire on under his voters and make it as difficult as possible for both the Biden administration and also for progressives to get any kind of foothold in terms of where the nation is going. Does that make sense? Yes? Nod your heads. Yes? All of you? Okay. Let me begin. First of all, I want to urge you to keep your expectations down initially with regard to the Biden administration. And I say that for a number of reasons. Number one, because like Obama, and to a lesser extent, like Clinton when they came into office, Biden is facing a huge set of crises that are going to take a lot of his political capital. Obviously, the big one is the coronavirus and the vaccines and getting vaccines out, administering all of this in a highly contentious environment. The close second one is the economy, and the economy we can talk about. It's not going to come back soon or easily because it is obviously, and the problems of the economy are related directly to the coronavirus. And we can get into that in more detail, but the point is simply that the Biden administration is going to have its hands full right away, just simply dealing with the immediate problems. Secondly, the mandate that presidents have when they come in is extremely important in terms of being able to rely on the public. There is not much of a Biden mandate. I mean, basically, there are only two things that the public is, at least the public that voted for Joe Biden, has very clearly said to Joe Biden through its vote. Number one, stop the coronavirus. And number two, don't be Trump. That is, be the antithesis of Donald Trump. Well, that's an important set of mandates, but it's not really a mandate for action in terms of many of the progressive issues and the bending the arc, the moral arc of the universe toward justice that we would like to see. There was not nearly the blue wave that I would have liked to see, many of you would have liked to see, that would have transported anybody, particularly Joe Biden or anybody who was president, into kind of a transformational uh, presidency. Thirdly, let me just remind you that America is still traumatized from the Trump administration. And when I use the term trauma, I use it quite advisedly. That is, people are shocked and outraged, not only at what Donald Trump did, but also at the people he managed to mobilize. And Trump voters, likewise, are shocked and outraged at what they perceive on the other side of the Great Divide. We are divided today more than I have ever seen in my lifetime. I started in politics, I hate to say this, 52 years ago. I was an intern in Robert F. Kennedy's Senate office. So I've seen a lot, and I've seen, Newt Gingrich coming into town and into power as Speaker of the House in 1995. I thought that was as bad as it could get in terms of divisiveness. But obviously, we are at a new extreme in terms of divisiveness right now. And the flame that, and the fire that Trump and Giuliani and Lindsey Graham and others are now creating about this election, trying to cast doubt on this election, is going to continue to haunt not only the Biden administration, but also anything that we as progressives want to get done in America. Let me also say, obviously, we've got a Supreme Court that has 6 members who are not likely to be terribly supportive of a lot of bold initiatives, and we have Mitch McConnell and Republicans still in charge. January 5th may change that in terms of the runoffs in Georgia, but I don't want anybody to count on that. I don't think it's useful for us to assume that those runoffs are going to go in our direction. So I don't want to make you gloomy. This is not about gloom and doom. I simply want to be realistic about what we can expect from Joe Biden. Joe Biden himself is cautious. He has shown himself as a politician who has always taken a rather cautious road. If there is a big parade going in one direction and he believes in the direction of the parade, he'll run and get in front of the parade. That is, but there has got to be the parade there first for him to want to get in front of it. His values, I think, I have every reason to believe his values are good and positive in terms of the values that most of us share. But again, that caution means that we, all of us, have got to mobilize and organize like mad to make him comfortable with moving in some of the directions we think he ought to be moving in. Well, that's really the first point I wanted to make. The second point, in terms of strategy, how do we move the Biden administration? How do we conduct ourselves as progressives? I think one of the most important things I can bring to the table is perhaps a framing issue, how we frame some of what we want to do or how we frame our pushing of the Biden administration. I think the answer is we don't frame it as pushing the Biden administration. That is, the more that this is seen as progressives trying to take on centrist Democrats, the more we play into the press's, the media's preferred way of viewing this, but the more we dig a hole for ourselves, because we are then marginalizing ourselves. We're making it harder to create the kind of alliances with and between and across the bottom 2/3 of America by income and by wealth, by power. And so I think a different way of framing might be to say, look, the Democratic Party traditionally has represented working Americans and the poor and people of color. And the Democratic Party must continue to build those alliances. And it's more important than ever today, because not only are people of color and working people falling behind, but the gap in opportunity, the gap in upward mobility, the gap in political power is getting greater and greater. And this is stuff that you all know, but I just want to make sure you have this firmly in your head. And that is that over the last 40 years, somebody who does not have a college education, the non-college educated portion of America, and that's 2/3 of adults, the non-college educated portion of America over the last 40 years has lost almost 20% in income, adjusted for inflation. Now, that's extraordinary when you think of every other advanced country has done so much better in terms of its working class, its non-college graduates. If the Democratic Party is not careful, judging from the exit polls and what we know about the 2020 election, the Democratic Party is going to become the party of the college educated, and the Republican Party is going to take over more and more as the party of the non-college educated. And that would be a tragedy, given the structural changes that have happened in this country and the plight of the non-college educated in this country. So again, warning, not to marginalize ourselves by saying we are the progressive left of the left, we are left of the center, we're the left of the Democratic Party. That might have been fine, 10 years ago or 20 years ago, but today I think it does make it more difficult to create the kind of alliances and build the kind of structures we need to build. The second point in terms of strategy, there's a great deal that Joe Biden and the Biden administration can do without going to Congress. Now, maybe you've already had sessions on this. Maybe you've already talked about it. I don't want to repeat stuff that you've already gone through. But issues that are at the center of the bottom 2/3 of this country in terms of helping them get ahead, that is lowering drug prices, for example, that could be done by executive order. You don't need to get congressional action on that. I made a list. There's also canceling student debts, publicly held student debt. That is something that a Biden administration could do by executive order. Breaking up the big banks. That's something the Biden administration could do by executive order. And in fact, a lot of antitrust, a lot of anti-monopoly action could be done not only by executive order, but simply by administrative action. Making it easier to form unions. I can tell you as a former labor secretary, there's so many things that can be done administratively to make it easier to form unions that the Biden administration could do. Doesn't need Mitch McConnell, doesn't need the Republicans. Also bear in mind, the government is a huge purchaser from the private sector of goods and services. Approximately 20% or more of the entire U.S. economy is based on government purchases. All of that purchasing can be subject to regulations and executive orders in terms of impose requirements on the private sector. If you want to be a reputable and if you want to be eligible for government purchasing, you've got to have X, Y, and Z. That is under the aegis of the federal government, of the executive branch, of the president, and you don't need to have Congress's approval for that. Public lands, we could have a whole discussion about public lands. I'm sure many of you understand how much can be done by the executive with regard to public lands. There's a whole list. Overtime pay, the Obama administration, I think, did some very important work on overtime pay. Trump rejected it. Most of those Trump executive orders, most of the Trump regulations can be reversed and should be reversed. And that ought to be part of the day one agenda. So there is room for optimism about what the Biden administration can do without Congress and can and should do relatively quickly. There is room for a little bit of anxiety about, let's say, what it will do or how bold Joe Biden will be. Finally, what about Trump voters? I know many of you probably have the same question in your minds as I do. How can 71 million Americans, after what we saw and went through over the past 4 years, the nightmare of divisiveness and nastiness and anger and everything else that Donald Trump represents, how can 71 million people still have voted for this sociopath? Well, let me just give you my assessment. The biggest force in American politics on the left and the right is anti-establishment anger. I've seen it grow. When I was labor secretary, I used to go out to the Midwest and to the South and to the West and talk to a lot of working people. And when I got back from them, this was this was in the 90s and the early 90s. When I got back from them consistently is a sense that they kept saying to me, look, I'm working harder than ever and I'm not getting ahead. And I don't understand why. I think the game is rigged against me. I began hearing that term in the 1990s. The game is rigged against me more and more. And then after the financial crisis of 2008, I heard it even more. And many of the people who I knew from my days as labor secretary, when I go back out to the Rust Belt or the South or anywhere, I'd look them up and I'd hear from them the same attitude, but it was angrier. Because the banks got bailed out and many Americans, obviously, as you know, lost their homes, their jobs, their savings, and nobody went to jail. And out of that anger emerged not only the brief Occupy movement, but also the Tea Party movement. And in fact, in many respects, Bernie Sanders is the direct lineal descendant of the Occupy movement, and Donald Trump is the direct lineal descendant of the Tea Party movement. And that anger and that sense of alienation, the sense of anxiety is not going away on either side. Authoritarian populism is being fanned today by Donald Trump. The reason he's getting such a reception for his absolutely baseless claims of voter fraud is that there is already deep suspicion and distrust in the system. He's planted a lot of it, but it was already there. That's my point. And I think one of the most important things that we can do as progressives, as we reach out to the other side, is to say, look, we are with you in terms of our suspicion and anger about the system. It is rigged. It's not rigged in exactly the way you think it is. At least we don't think it is. But we understand what you're angry about, and we want to fix it. And we can only fix it if we join together. Corporate welfare, the kind of crony capitalism that you are so opposed to, we are opposed to as well. We don't like the payoffs. We don't like the corruption. We don't like the bribery. We don't stand for the kind of corrosive politics and system that many of you are opposed to as well. In other words, if you start from kitchen table issues, kitchen table economics, what it is that they are really upset about over the kitchen table, their jobs, their health care, their premiums, the deductibles, the impossibility of affording childcare, the impossibility of affording college, all of the things that people are worried about over the kitchen table, we are too. These are Trump voters. There is no reason that many of them can't join us, and we can't join them, at least for particular purposes. We've got to, I think, become the party of the bottom 2/3. And on that note, Aaron, I hope I haven't been too dismissive or discouraging. But actually, I am optimistic. I've always been optimistic. I think there is this kind of long cosmic moral universe that does bend in the direction of justice, and it's still bending that way. So thank you, and I'll take your questions.
No, thank you. Your remarks are really thought-provoking, and there's so much there. On the light side, I want to tell my nation colleagues that I think we should make a Mobilize Like Mad t-shirt pronto. Um, and, while that's in my thoughts, what does mobilizing like mad look like?
Is that a question to me?
Yeah.
I'll tell you, we've already been doing it. At the grassroots, as I travel around the country, at least before COVID, I was amazed at the degree of local engagement, particularly young people, particularly people of color. Starting with the midterms of 2018, I haven't seen this degree of activism. And I'll tell you something else. As somebody who has spent the last 40 years teaching young people, I have never had the honor and privilege of teaching a generation that is as committed to social change, positive social change, and as dedicated as the generation I am now teaching. So, that's another thing that gives me huge optimism about the future.
Thanks. In your remarks, you also talked about the demographics of the parties and how they could change and what it would mean. And Yukari Miyami asks, the Republican Party is gaining votes from non-white people. How did Democrats see that?
Well, as I suggested, I think that part of that is not just race, but class. That is, if you look carefully at the results of this past election, what you see is a remarkable pattern in which class is becoming, in a way, as important as race. In some cases, it's trumping race. I hate to use that verb, excuse me. I'm never going to use it again. But what we see is that people who are Black people, Latinx people, others who are working class, some of them, particularly the men, have been attracted to Trumpism. And we could go into a lot of sociological reasons for that, but I think that one thing Trump has managed to pull the wool over many people's eyes and create the impression that he is a working class tribune. They don't get the information that we have. They don't know that he has been a Trojan horse for the oligarchy of America, and he has been. And I think that's in terms of messaging, but also in terms of action, that is critically important that we get across.
Thank you. Jordan Weltman and Judith Stacy have some questions that seem to go together. Jordan points out that he read that exit polls show that 83% of Trump voters and 17% of Biden voters prioritize the economy. Shouldn't that be reversed, and how do we reverse it? And Judith adds on, how does prioritizing the economy interact with racism?
I think that Donald Trump managed to persuade people, and he does this, and the Republicans do it just by the old telling the big lie over and over and over again. I mean, we've now experienced this. There's no reason anybody should have any doubts about the technique of doing this. But he's persuaded people that he was a business person, and therefore he and the Republican Party know about the economy. The reality is that Democrats have a better economic record if you look at wages and jobs than Republicans since the Second World War, or go back to the beginning of the Clinton administration. There is no question about this. We've got to actually help people to see this. This is a fact. And we've got to repeat it over and over again. And we also have got to make sure that people understand that the key to the economy, the key to economic growth, is from the bottom up. It's not from the top down. That is, trickle-down economics is a cruel hoax. It doesn't work. The Republicans have tried it over and over and over. You give tax breaks to people at the top, nothing trickles down. The only way you really get jobs and wages is if you give people the wherewithal, the ability to become productive. And that means public investments in education, in healthcare, in infrastructure, in job the creation, the abilities to even create jobs, access to capital, also childcare. I mean, these are all things that enable people to be productive. They start from the bottom. They give people who are low income or moderate income or working class people the tools they need to get ahead. And we've seen again and again, this works. I mean, bottom-up economics works. Top-down, trickle-down economics is a hoax. We've got to make sure people understand that. We've got to make sure people understand that we, that is Democrats, progressives, are the people who have delivered on the economy.
Thank you. Let's talk a little bit about what's possible with the new Biden administration. Chuck Carlson is wondering what issues can be pushed or taken up by Biden, and Lee Elkins wonders, how can Biden construct his agenda to address the economy and making the economy work for the majority?
Let me just answer that by saying that it's going to be somewhat difficult, as long as the Senate remains in Republican hands, to do some of the bold things that you and I presumably would like to have done. That is, substantially raise taxes on the wealthy so that we have the money we need for public investment. This is something that Joe Biden campaigned on, and his tax reforms are actually, some of them are really great. I mean, I could talk about them in ways that I'm afraid would make your eyes glaze over, like the stepped up basis at death. Does that mean anything? I mean, I say these things, and many people who don't know what the stepped up basis at death means get a little bit, glazed in terms of their eyes. But it's tremendously important because what it essentially means right now under tax law, when somebody who is very wealthy dies, all of the capital gains are erased. They basically, their heirs get all of what their fathers or their mothers or their grandparents have left them without paying any capital gains at all. It is a vehicle for creating dynastic wealth, and over the next 20 or 30 years, there will be the greatest intergenerational transfer of wealth in American history, something in the order of $30 to $40 trillion from wealthy baby boomers to their children and grandchildren. If you don't step up the basis, that is, if you don't allow these transfers without any capital gains, then you actually generate a lot of revenue, and you put a little bit of a restraint on this extraordinary transfer of wealth, which is dangerous for the country. It's dangerous to have an aristocracy. As the great jurist Louis Brandeis once said, we have a choice. We can either have great wealth in the hands of a few, or we can have a democracy, but we can't have both.
Thank you. Kathleen Manning is wondering, how do we counter Trump's success with creating an alternate reality? And I'm going to add on a question from Paul Sowers, too, because I think these are related. The question is, how do we create a progressive media infrastructure?
We've been talking about a progressive media infrastructure for at least 25 to 30 years, maybe before that. I remember having discussions in the late 1980s about a progressive media structure. And some of us got together and we founded the American Prospect magazine, and others of us got together and we founded the Economic Policy Institute, and we got together and we created a lot of beginnings of infrastructure, and The Nation magazine is a big and major part of that infrastructure. But the problem is that too much of the time, I think we just preach to the converted. That is, it's an isolated bubble of an infrastructure. More attention needs to be given to how to get to the people who have not yet made up their minds, or to attract viewers. And you can do it on social media. I mean, I've spent In fact, I am embarrassed to say how much time I am spending on social media, on not just Facebook and on Twitter and on even TikTok. I mean, can you imagine? I mean, here we have, I hate to admit it, okay? I'm going to admit it. A 74-year-old former cabinet official spending my time on TikTok. But I am absolutely sure that that is a way to get to young people. And what do I have? Maybe 100 or 110,000 TikTok followers. Well, you know, that's important. I laugh about it and I make jokes about it, but we've got to reach out not only to the other side, but to the uncommitted middle and to young people. People between the ages of 18 and 21 form their political views. They begin hardening around the ages of 21, 22. So we need to get to people who are teenagers, who are whose minds are much more open, who can and are interested, who are eager to learn about the system.
Well, you're really striking a chord because your following in all of these channels is enormous.
Well, I'm trying. We're trying. I have a wonderful little team of people who work with me who are very, very talented, and it's just a great deal of work. Let's face it. It's you know, it's not the kind of work. It's probably not as hard as publishing a magazine every week, but it is very labor intensive. But I think the payoff is important.
Great. Sid Caskey is looking for some clarification, and again, this is a conversation that has come up throughout our festival so far. He writes, the idea of dialogue with Trump supporters is much maligned. Your point seems to be that we should reach out to them for dialogue. Is that right?
Yes, but in a certain way. That is, I've done a lot of talking to Trump supporters over the last 4 years. I've made it a point whenever I find them. In fact, sometimes it's informal. Sometimes I actually go to places and give talks to groups that are Trumpies. And what I've discovered is this. The way to begin is not to talk about labels, isms, socialism, not to talk about capitalism, not to talk about the left versus the right, not to talk about the Democratic Party, not to talk about Trump. Where you begin, as I suggested before, is you talk about what's on their personal agenda, their minds. Usually it has to do, I find, with their jobs. So I will start a conversation by saying, well, just tell me about what you do. And they will tell me. And then I'll say, do you like your job? Well, and then they begin to reveal some of the problems they're having. They don't have sick leave. They don't have any protections with regard to this or that. Their real incomes are actually dropping, or their employers are cutting costs there, here and there. And you begin to see where the core of their anger actually comes from in terms of their job, in terms of the private sector, in terms of how the system is organized. And then you build on that and you give them your personal anecdotes, things that you are angry about, that have to do with your lives as well. Finding that common ground at the micro level, I have found to be enormously important, because that gives you a foundation to then build onto the macro level. Well, why is it happening? Why are you so afraid of being fired? I mean, what has happened to your uncle or your aunt who now just barely struggling, getting by? What's happening to your oldest child who can't even didn't stay in school because she couldn't afford it, and you can't afford it? And in other words, you build on these shared problems. That's the discussion.
Thank you. We have a question harkening back to policies from 2008 that I think has resonance today. Flores Bishop writes, why was there no freeze on evicting people who were enticed into loans they could afford presented, but could not afford the doubling of the mortgage 5 years out? And some of these homes went into ruin where they stood. What was the logic behind that? And since we're certainly in a moment of great economic stress with people in precarious positions, what are our policies and options now?
Well, let me just take the first part of that. I think that the Obama administration made a terrible mistake in terms of bailing out the banks with very few conditions on the banks, also not sending any banker to jail. Meanwhile, not helping nearly the number of homeowners who needed help, not preventing evictions, not doing a lot of things for ordinary working people that should have been done. That, to me, is a major blemish, not only on the Obama administration, but also on Democrats generally. I think Democrats, in many, many respects, and it goes all the way back to the Clinton administration. And I saw this, and I can't reveal particular conversations, but let me just say that I saw the Democratic Party abandon the working class in this country for the so-called suburban swing vote, but it often was translated into upper middle class people who could come over to the Democrats if they had more confidence that Democrats wouldn't raise their taxes, et cetera. Well, that's not where Democrats ought to be. So a lot of the legacy that we are dealing with today of distrust coming from the working class, coming from lower middle class people, has to do with the financial crisis of 2008 and the aftermath.
Denise Wilner asks, what about Trump supporters' fear of losing their freedom to government programs, which via negative propaganda on their social media they see as socialism? Can we show them that Trump moves toward authoritarianism is a greater threat to their freedom? And I think what's implied in that question, here's my question. Why does socialism strike fear into people's hearts, but authoritarianism doesn't?
I don't think people think in terms of isms. I really don't. People think in terms of Medicare or Social Security. That's what Democrats have got to talk about. Let's expand Medicare. I mean, I remember those demonstrations when Barack Obama was trying to push the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. The demonstrations that would have conservatives holding signs that said, "Don't take away my Medicare." Many people who are on the right or who have been hoodwinked into becoming Trump supporters somehow assume that Medicare and Social Security and many things they take for granted are just there or are foundational programs. They don't realize that they were attacked as being socialistic or being parts of socialism, that they are the results of huge amounts of work. Even the Clinton administration, the first thing that the Clinton administration signed into law that I, as Secretary of Labor, implemented was the Family and Medical Leave Act, which it's not paid leave. It should be paid leave, like most other countries, advanced countries in the world, but at least it's something. And a lot of working people kind of, and even Trump supporters that I run into, take it for granted. It can't be taken for granted. Much of what Trump supporters actually rely on as a practical matter are programs that Democrats put into place. And we've got to remind them of that over and over and over again. Authoritarianism is an abstraction. And I think that the core of the authoritarianism that Trump has been promoting has been a deep and abiding paranoia and distrust combined with racism. And he's taken the anxiety and fear that many middle and working class people have, and a lot of that is justifiable, but has channeled it into xenophobia, racism, and paranoia. And that has been, we're living with that. We're living it right now. I don't know how many of you saw the Monmouth University poll that came out yesterday. It showed that 70% of people who voted for Donald Trump in the recent election feel that the election was rigged, is fraudulent. Now, how do you deal with that? I mean, I think we can deal with that. I mean, over time, we can deal with that. But what Trump is doing is undercutting people's faith in the institutions of our democracy. And that is the most reprehensible legacy of all of the reprehensible legacies that Donald Trump is leaving us with.
Thank you. I'd just like to follow up. When faith in institutions is undermined, that's a long road back to fix that. What is the process to put that to right?
Well, Erin, first of all, let me say that it is a long road to get here. That is, our institution, our faith in our institutions, our democratic institutions, has been eroded for many, 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 many years. Part of that erosion has had to do with big money in politics, with big corporations and very wealthy people in both parties dominating the funding of both parties. I mean, I remember Tony Coelho, who was head of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee in the 1980s, a Democrat. He led the way for the Democratic Party to drink at the same financial trough as the Republicans, saying, well, we are going to be here in Congress. We're going to run the House forever, and we might as well take advantage of that and get the money from big corporations and the financial sector and from wealthy people. Well, that was a Faustian bargain. That was a deal with the devil, in the sense of actually undercutting people's faith in the integrity of democratic institutions. I think that Democrats have played a role in this. My only point is that it's going to be a long road back. H.R. 1, the first piece of legislation proposed by the Democrats when they took over in 2018, when they took over the House, is an extremely important piece of legislation that begins the process of rebuilding faith in our democratic institutions. And I hope the Democrats take that up and run with it.
Yesdiar would like to know her question. A visible movement has started on the left to form a progressive party. It's relying on the many Bernie Sanders supporters, both within and outside the Democratic Party, to step out of the Democratic Party and consolidate the progressives who are scattered all over our political spectrum. What is your view about forming a progressive people's party?
Well, I want to be very clear about this, because I have said publicly, and I believe in my core, that if the Democrats fail to really improve the well-being of the typical worker, of the working class and the lower middle class, and improve the not just wages, but also working conditions, healthcare, access to education, access to all sorts of public needs, then not only shame on the Democrats, but also we do need a working person's party or a progressive party. And there are possibly people who are Trumpers, anti-establishment, who would join that party. But the big danger, and this comes up every time anybody brings up a third party, is that you draw off votes from the party who is closest to you ideologically. And the Green Party, I mean, I remember when Ralph Nader in 2000, well, clearly, I mean, I love Ralph Nader, but he did draw votes away from Al Gore. And you just can't pretend that doesn't exist. That problem and that reality.
Yes. Charlene Bangs Peterson asks, how can you get this message of Trump just using his supporters as a wall to continue his misinformation, lies, and subversiveness? What tool can be used to truly educate people through this cloud that they've surrounded themselves with? And then I would add, there's talk of whether Trump would be prosecuted for crimes or not when he leaves office. What do you think of that possibility?
Well, I think it's very important to hold people accountable. I mean, this word accountability, we talk about a lot, but the more that people feel that they can get away with anything in public life, I'm talking about not only Trump, but Giuliani, and Lindsey Graham and Newt Gingrich and all of these people and William Barr. I mean, all of these people who contributed, I think, in fundamentally both illegal and immoral ways to where we are right now. They have got to be held accountable in some way. Now, if they've broken the law, they have got to be held accountable to the law. I think one of the sources of cynicism in America right now is the sense that people who have wealth and power are above the law. And that cynicism is corrosive. Now, how do you do that without deepening the divide, without making people even angrier who are Trump supporters? I think what we all have to do, and this is easy to say, it's very, very difficult to do. We all have to go back to original principles. We've got to talk about the morality of being in a democracy, of what that means in terms of our responsibilities to one another. We've got to redefine patriotism. Instead of the Trumpian view of patriotism, which is we're better than them, a kind of zero-sum game, we've got to over and over and over again say in various forms what John F. Kennedy said in his inaugural speech. We've got to ask each other what we owe each other as members of the same society. That's what patriotism means. It means sacrificing for the greater good. We've got to talk about the common good. Now, we've got to do it in ways that are not corny and not Frank Capra-esque. But I think that in middle America, when I go out to not only the Rust Belt, but to small town, rural America, and I start talking in, you know what I mean by Frank Capra-esque language, I get a receptiveness. That is, people really do have in their hearts a yearning for being part of something that is morally right, that where they feel like there is social solidarity around a vision of an America that they feel that they've lost. And that was the vision I grew up with. I mean, it was a vision that came out of the common experience of the Depression of the 1930s and then World War II. And it reached its kind of, in some ways, its epitome in the rhetoric of John F. Kennedy and in the deeds pre-Vietnam of Lyndon Johnson.
Thank you. I want to go back to possibilities of policy in the Biden administration. Michael Dolber asks, you mentioned student loan forgiveness. Do you think that there's a realistic chance that Biden would issue that executive order? It's probably the best economic stimulus we could have.
I agree. It's a terrific economic stimulus. He can do it without Congress. He can do it by executive order. I think he ought to forgive, let's say, $50,000 for families that have a family household income of up to $100,000 or $120,000 for household income. This is Elizabeth Warren's proposal, essentially, and then forgive more on a graduated basis. This is not radical, and it shouldn't be regarded as radical. There are various ways you can do this, and I think it ought to be among his highest and first priorities.
Thank you. Margaret O'Mara has a question. In the interest of full transparency, I will tell everybody, yes, we are related. She's my incredible sister-in-law. And she says, speaking of mis and disinformation, how does the social media environment and engaging and addictive qualities baked into these platforms contrast with the other and earlier kinds of political media? And what are the policy solutions to address and overcome that?
Margaret O'Mara, sister of Aaron. Let me just say historically, we have in this country had a lot of experience with sensational yellow journalism, with a kind of journalism that fed and has fed on lies. That was basically journalism in the 1870s, 1880s in this country. We became more professional in journalism, but we still had the National Enquirer, and we still had, and then starting really relatively recently, but it may seem like forever ago, Fox News. I think that the best way to deal with social media is to make them, and I'm talking about Mark Zuckerberg and others, make them publishers. I mean, that is acknowledge that Facebook is a giant publisher. It is one of the most, it is the largest media organization, perhaps in the world. And it needs to act like and be responsible as other media organizations are. I'm not saying every media organization is responsible. Again, Fox News. But you need, at least going back to my theme of accountability, you need some accountability there. Otherwise, the business model that is at the heart of Facebook and also YouTube, Google, and others, that business model is based upon a certain form of sensationalism that is designed to titillate, anger, and also make people more and more extreme as they go deeper and deeper into every little rabbit hole that they are led to. It's dangerous. A lot of it, a huge amount of it is false. And Facebook and these others are making gigantic amounts of money on it. I mean, we've got to stop this. There are many, we could have a whole session on how we do that. I'm convinced there are ways of doing it, but it requires changes in the law.
Yes, and to let our audience know, Zephyr Teachout has written quite a bit about this and written for The Nation about the power of these platforms, and she's going to be talking with us later.
Zephyr has done a great job. Also, Shoshana Zuboff has written a book called Surveillance Capitalism, which I think is a marvelous book if you haven't read it up before now.
Thank you. Back to more policy. Denise Wilner says, yes, let's get money out of politics. Is Citizens United on Biden's agenda?
I don't know, but it's Citizens United, unless you change the Supreme Court or we have a constitutional amendment, it's hard to know exactly what to do about Citizens United, except there are things that can be done legislatively. And this brings me back to H.R. 1, the first legislation proposed by the House of Representatives in 2018, and that was public financing of elections. It's not the answer entirely to Citizens United, but it is a big part of the answer.
Thank you. There are a few questions in the chat about parties and structure of our political system. And Susan Paston says, if in time we can actually abolish the Electoral College, would third parties stand a better chance?
Yes, I think we've got to abolish the Electoral College. But again, by Constitution, trying to do it by the Constitution or by constitutional amendment is enormously difficult. The best bet we have, it seems to me, is either the Interstate Compact, which is now advancing in many states, in which members, that is legislatures who agree to that Interstate Compact, basically say, look, we will automatically, if we get a number of legislatures to agree up to 270 electoral votes, we will automatically award all of our electoral votes to whoever gets 270 votes. That is, we will make sure that there is never again an instance in which somebody who did not win the popular vote gets to be president. And that's, to me, the best bet and the easiest bet. Beyond that, I think we need to give statehood to the District of Columbia, maybe Puerto Rico. That would help. Because one of the problems with the Electoral College really touches on a fundamental distortion in our system. And that is that you've got two senators from states like Wyoming that have, 450,000 people, and two senators from a state like you're hearing me from, where I'm coming from right now, California, and we've got, 30 million or 35 million? I haven't looked at the latest figures, but this not only distorts the Senate, it also distorts the Electoral College, because Electoral College, the number of electors you get is depending on the number of senators and number of representatives.
And we have a question about the Senate, so this is a good time for it. Flores Bishop says, what about the Senate, which is perennially conservative? Would we do better under a parliamentary system? Is it time for another constitutional convention, or is that too scary?
It's too scary. We would do better if we were starting over with a parliamentary system. I think the founding fathers made a fundamental mistake in that regard. But an Article 5 convention, which is really what you're talking about. I mean, just think of the crazy loonies who might come to an Article 5 convention or get themselves appointed to an Article 5 convention. I mean, think of it. If you want to be scared, think of Roger Stone's, dominating an Article 5 convention, and suddenly we would find that everything in our Constitution and our Bill of Rights was gone. I don't want to take that chance, frankly.
Robin Scher asks, what about ranked choice voting, especially in primaries?
I'm all in favor of ranked choice voting. I think it's shown itself to be really a positive thing in Maine and other places where it's been tried. There are a lot of institutional reforms like that. I think we ought to get rid of the filibuster because the filibuster really is an anti-democratic small d feature of the Senate it just makes it almost impossible to get anything through, particularly this Senate, but I think in Senates past. We ought to, as I said, grant statehood to more states. And I have been peddling an idea for years, and I never get any support on this. Forgive me for even mentioning it, because I'm going to be shot down by many of you. But I think states like California ought to be made into 2 states or 3 states.
Yeah. We are out of time. There's so many more questions. This was extraordinary. I'm so grateful. And I guess I'll just ask, in the 2 minutes we have left, there's an extraordinarily interested, energized, and powerful audience here. What would you like to leave them with?
Well, January 5th is the Georgia runoff. This is obviously critically important because it's one way, in fact, probably the best way we have of getting the Senate back, because it would mean Kamala Harris would have the deciding vote. It would be 50-50 in the Senate if we got both of those senators in a runoff. I don't know whether to count on that, but we can, all of us, in various ways, as I've talked about before, mobilize, energize, make sure to the extent that we can that happens. There are many other things that we can do as well. I think that the most important maybe idea or lesson I should leave you with is that, number one, it's important not to get discouraged. This is a very long road. It's a lifetime in a way. I mean, elections themselves, too many progressives, too many others really regard an election as the end of the battle. I mean, you get good people in or you get bad people out and then you forget about it. No, in my experience, you can have the best people in Washington, but if you don't have good people outside Washington pushing those people in Washington to do the right thing, then the status quo is simply maintained because there are too many special interests that are forcing the status quo or actually regressive forces. The other thing I want to suggest is not burning out. And when I say that, I simply mean that being an activist, being a social change activist takes so much energy, and it is such a long road that you've got to build into your psyche and into your schedule and into your family an opportunity to have fun and take some time out to kind of reboot. I know too many people who have been activists for 3 or 4 or 10 or 8 years, and they just burn themselves out, and they're good for nobody. They're certainly not good for the movement. So take care of yourself. Understand that this is a long process. This is a lifetime process for many of us, and be careful with yourself. I have a lot more to say, but I think those are those are the 2 I will leave you with, Erin. And thank you so much, and thank you all for coming to this festival. My thanks to the nation and Katrina Van Hummel and everybody else who has worked so hard over the years to help build this movement.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your insight and your remarks and the example you set. We're so lucky to have you here and have had this time. We're grateful. Next up is I-Jen Poo and George Gale in conversation, and so we'll be back in just a minute.
Bye.